Imagine arriving weary from the long, dusty road. The sun has dipped low, and lanterns glow warmly from a timbered building at the village crossroads. The scent of roasting meat drifts through the air, mingling with wood smoke and ale. Inside, a medieval innkeeper is bustling, welcoming travelers, stoking fires, and ensuring the mugs never run dry. Tonight, let us slip quietly into the life of one such innkeeper. From dawn until nightfall, we'll follow their steady rhythm of work and rest in a world long gone, but full of charm. The air is still heavy with the last of the night's coolness. In a small chamber above the main hall, the innkeeper slowly rises from his straw mattress. The sound of birdsong drifts through the narrow wooden shutters, faint but insistent. The rooster's crow from the yard is the surest signal that morning has begun. He rubs his eyes, sits up, and lets his feet touch the cool wooden floorboards worn smooth by years of use. The room is plain but serviceable, with thick timber beams overhead and whitewashed plaster walls. The smell of smoke from last night's hearth lingers faintly in the air. It is neither luxurious nor poor, just practical, the kind of space where one does not linger but merely sleeps before the day's labors call again. He dresses slowly in a woolen tunic, worn but sturdy, with an apron tied at his waist. A heavy leather belt hangs at his side, from which a ring of iron keys dangles. Each key fits a door or a chest in the inn, one for the cellar, one for the cellar. For the ale casks, one for the storeroom where bread and flour are kept safe from mice. To be an innkeeper is not simply to serve food and drink, but to be keeper of provisions, of stories, of safety. The first task of the day is always to light the fire. He descends the creaking wooden stairs, careful not to wake his wife and children still asleep in their chambers. The common room is hushed, but the smell of stale ale and wood smoke lingers from the night before. Tankards remain stacked on the long oak tables, their rims sticky with dried mead and wine. A bench has been tipped over, likely the result of a quarrel between two travelers that his apprentice had separated before midnight. The innkeeper writes it quietly, sighing at the thought of the endless cycle of tidying, refilling and preparing. Kneeling by the hearth, he arranges kindling and breathes life into the embers that still glow faintly in the ashes. Soon, orange tongues of flame lick upward, and the crackle of burning wood fills the silence. The warmth begins to spread through the great hall, chasing away the damp chill. The inn is waking, even if no one else yet stirs. From the kitchen, he collects a small loaf of bread baked the day before. Its crust is tough, but a mug of watered ale softens the bite. This is his breakfast, plain and quick, for he eats not for pleasure, but to give strength for the hours ahead. His wife, when she rises, will knead dough for the new day's loaves, while the apprentice boy will fetch water from the well and sweep the floor. But for now, the innkeeper is alone with the fire, the bread, and his thoughts. He glances at the benches and tables and thinks of the travelers who slept upstairs. A merchant carrying bolts of cloth to the market town, a weary pilgrim bound for a distant shrine, two soldiers who said little and kept their cloaks tight about them, a fiddler who had entertained the hall before vanishing to bed with his instrument slung over his shoulder. Each has their own reason for being here, and each leaves behind a trace, a coin, a story, a broken mug. The innkeeper gathers them all, not as possessions, but as fragments of the world that passes through his doors. By now, the sky beyond the shutters is lightening. The faint pink of dawn streaks across the horizon. Soon the inn will hum with activity, pots will clatter in the kitchen, hooves will strike the courtyard as horses are saddled. The common room will fill again with chatter, the sound of men and women preparing for another day's journey. But in this early hour, before the first guest stirs, there is only quiet, and the innkeeper savors it. He moves toward the cellar door, unlocking it with one of the heavy keys. Down he goes into the cool, earthen-scented space where barrels of ale and wine rest in shadow. The casks must be checked each morning, their taps tightened, the levels noted. Too little ale, and guests will complain. Too much spilled, and profit is lost. He runs his hand across the wood, feeling the cool dampness, and listens to the hollow echo of liquid within. He has done this for years, yet it remains one of his most important rituals. Returning upstairs, he pauses to listen. Above, the boards creak, the sound of guests rising. The day is beginning in earnest now. His apprentice stumbles in, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and the innkeeper instructs him to sweep the floor and set the benches straight. Soon his wife will appear, her sleeves rolled high, flour dusting her hands as she begins the day's baking. The inn is a machine, each person a part of its rhythm, and it is his role to keep it running smoothly. Yet even as he prepares for another day of labor, he cannot help but feel a quiet pride. For though his work is endless, it is here, in this place, that strangers find food, warmth, and rest. His inn is a beacon for the weary, and he, its keeper. As the first rays of sunlight slip through the shutters, he takes a final sip of ale, straightens his apron, and breathes deeply. Another day has begun. The morning light drifts slowly across the heavy oak beams of the inn's great hall, painting them in soft amber. By now, the innkeeper has stepped out into the main room, moving with the steady pace of someone who knows the rhythm of each day. The fire in the central hearth has burned down to little more than ash and glowing coals. But this is the heart of the inn, and it must never be allowed to die completely. With practiced hands, he gathers fresh logs from the woodpile stacked neatly against the wall. The timber is seasoned, chosen carefully to give a long, steady burn. He lays it across the embers, tucking smaller kindling beneath, then bends low to coax the fire back to life. A soft crackle begins, then a sharper snap as the flame takes hold. Soon the room is filling with that comforting sound of wood, settling into its burn, sending warmth and smoke spiraling toward the chimney. The great hall is still empty, chairs and benches pulled slightly askew from the night before. Tankards remain on some of the tables, sticky with dried ale. Bread crumbs litter the rushes on the floor, where the soft matting of straw and herbs must later be swept and replaced. But for now, the innkeeper takes a moment to breathe in the quiet. Before long, the hall will ring with voices, merchants, pilgrims, travelers, villagers, and the calm of early morning will give way to the hum of business. The hearth fire is not only for warmth. Soon a pot of pottage will be set to simmer, a stew of barley, beans, and whatever vegetables are available from the garden or the market. A slab of pork fat may be added, if the inn has it to spare, though such luxuries are carefully measured. Bread, baked in yesterday's heat, is stacked neatly on the shelf, waiting to be sliced for guests. The smell of roasting and stewing will carry through the village road, a welcome sign for any traveller passing by. After the fire is secured, the innkeeper turns his attention to the room itself. The tables are wiped down with a cloth dampened in water scented faintly with rosemary. The benches are pushed back into order, though no two are ever quite the same size or shape. Each piece of furniture bears the mark of long years of use, scratches from knives, burns from dropped candles, initials carved when no one was watching. These imperfections, far from being flaws, are part of the inn's character. Next comes the floor. A broom made of bundled twigs is fetched, and the rushes are swept into a pile, carrying with them the remnants of the previous night, crumbs, dirt, the occasional chicken feather. The rushes are then replaced with fresh ones, newly gathered and cut from the marshland, mixed with dried lavender and mint to sweeten the air. This was not only for comfort, but also to ward off pests and to mask the earthy smells of so many feet, boots, and cloaks. As the hall begins to take shape again, the innkeeper's mind is never far from what the day may bring. Will merchants arrive from the nearby town, eager to rest their wagons and sample ale? Will pilgrims stop by, weary from the long road, seeking food and shelter before continuing their holy journey? Or perhaps a noble's messenger might arrive, cloaked in fine wool, bringing news from distant places. Each visitor brings with them stories, coins, and sometimes trouble. An innkeeper must be ready for all. On a shelf behind the bar rests the heavy ledger, bound in leather, where names and payments are recorded. The quill and inkpot beside it are ready, though few guests can write their own names. More often, the innkeeper records them himself, spelling as best he can from what he hears. These records are important not only for keeping accounts, but also for the eyes of the local reeve or lord, who may inquire about strangers passing through. The hall, though simple, is not without its touches of pride. Tapestries, faded by years of smoke, hang on the walls, showing hunts and saints in threadbare detail. A brass candlestick, polished until it gleams, sits at the center of the largest table, ready to be lit when the sun sinks. Small details like these remind travelers that this is more than just a shelter. It is a place of welcome, a hearth for all who enter. As the fire grows stronger and the room grows brighter, the innkeeper listens. Outside, the faint clatter of a cartwheel reaches his ears, along with the call of a rooster from a nearby yard. A dog barks, and the church bell begins its slow toll for the morning service. The village is stirring, and soon the inn will stir with it. By the time his wife or helpers come into the hall, the hearth is glowing steadily, the air carries a mix of wood smoke and herbs, and the inn looks ready for the day. What was disorder and shadow only an hour ago now feels alive again. This is the unseen work of the morning, quiet, uncelebrated, but essential. Without it, the inn would fall into chaos. With it, the day can begin in order and welcome. The innkeeper pauses one last time, resting his hand on the long wooden table. Soon, mugs will be filled, bread will be broken, and laughter will echo beneath the rafters. But for now, in this small space of calm, he allows himself to simply listen to the fire and breathe in the peace of a hall, prepared for the living hours ahead. The innkeeper moves quietly through the common room, the smell of roasted oats and warm bread drifting from the kitchen. The morning light filters through the shutters, laying golden stripes across the wooden tables that still hold the faint stains of last night's ale. Outside, the clatter of hooves on the stone road grows louder. Soon enough, the first travelers of the day arrive. 2 riders dismount, cloaks heavy with dew from their journey at dawn. Their horses snort, stamping their hooves as the stable boy rushes forward to lead them away. The innkeeper greets them with a polite nod, not overly warm, but not unfriendly either. Hospitality is a steady business, one that thrives on balance. The guests remove their hoods. One is a merchant, his leather pouch clinking softly as he adjusts his belt. His companion appears to be a guard or hired escort, with a short sword at his side and watchful eyes that scan the room. They step inside, rubbing their hands against. The chill, the innkeeper ushers them toward the hearth, where a fire still smoulders from the night before, fed with fresh logs at dawn. A pot of thin ale, warm and frothy, is poured into clay mugs. Alongside, bowls of pottage, a mixture of barley, root vegetables, and a trace of salted pork are placed before them. The merchant eats eagerly, spoon scraping the bottom of the bowl, while his guard eats more slowly, gaze drifting toward the windows as if measuring the road ahead. The innkeeper moves with calm purpose. To serve early guests is not just to provide food and drink, but to gather news. Between bites, the merchant speaks of his journey. A distant market, caravans slowed by muddy roads, rumors of bandits lurking near the river crossing. The innkeeper listens carefully, storing these details away like coins in a chest. For an inn is more than a place of rest. It is a crossroads of stories, a place where whispers of the outside world pass through like smoke. Soon, another traveler arrives. A weary monk, robes damp from the morning mist, leans on a walking staff. His sandals are worn, his shoulders bent with age, and the weight of a satchel carrying manuscripts. The innkeeper greets him with gentle courtesy, offering a seat near the fire. The monk accepts only a simple bowl of bread soaked in broth, murmuring a quiet blessing before eating. His presence fills the room with a different air, less hurried, more contemplative. As the morning lengthens, the inn begins to stir with a rhythm of arrivals and departures. A pair of farmers arrive with baskets of eggs and cheese, their goods both payment and barter. A young messenger clatters in on horseback, dust rising from his cloak as he gulps down a mug of ale before dashing out again. Each guest brings not only coin or trade, but a ripple of energy, shaping the inn's day in ways subtle and unseen. The innkeeper watches all of this with steady eyes. The business of an inn is measured not only in food served or beds filled, but in the flow of people and the quiet knowledge of their journeys. By mid-morning, the common room hums with soft chatter, clinking mugs, and the crackle of the fire. The first guests of the day have set the tone. The inn is alive once more, a small but vital part of the great road that runs through the land. As the morning wanes and the sun begins to climb higher in the sky, the inn finds itself at the busiest point of the day. The shadows that once stretched across the road outside now shrink, and the warmth of noon spreads over the town. Travelers who have set out at dawn are now eager for a place to rest their feet, refresh themselves, and find a meal before continuing on. For the innkeeper, this time of day is a whirlwind of movement, yet it must always be managed with calm precision. The clamour begins first at the door. The hinges creak as it swings open repeatedly, ushering in dusty riders, merchants carrying sacks of goods, pilgrims in worn cloaks, and even townsfolk looking for a hearty meal. Each guest enters with different needs, different expectations, and a story of where they have come from. Some are familiar faces, locals who dine here often, while others are strangers passing through, their accents and mannerisms speaking of distant lands. The common room, with its timbered beams and faint glow from the hearth, grows steadily louder. Tankards are filled, tables scraped and wiped, Stools shuffled across the floor. A fresh rush of heat from the fire blends with the aroma of food. Meat stews bubbling in the large iron pot, bread still warm from the morning's bake, and wheels of cheese brought out for slicing. The innkeeper must move between kitchen and common hall, ensuring no one is left waiting too long, for the comfort of travelers depends on quick service. Yet service is more than food and drink. The innkeeper knows the art of listening is just as important. A merchant at one table speaks of bandits on the road. Nearby, a pair of young squires boast of their master's victories. At another, a scholar unfurls a parchment map and quietly studies it while sipping spiced wine. The innkeeper pauses by each, nodding at the right moments, offering a word of reassurance here, a friendly joke there. Such moments create trust, and trust is the foundation upon which repeat guests return. The midday meal itself is a ritual of sorts. The innkeeper carries large platters of roasted vegetables, salted pork, and loaves of bread sliced thick enough to fill the stomachs of those who have traveled long miles. A pot of ale is passed around, and the room rings with clinking mugs and low laughter. The sounds overlap until they create a hum, a living rhythm that pulses through the inn. Behind the scenes, the work never stops. The servants scurry, clearing empty trenchers and refilling pitchers. The kitchen grows hot and smoky, the scent of onions and herbs mingling with the ever-present wood smoke. The innkeeper glances at the store of supplies, mentally tallying what must last the week and what will need to be purchased at the market. Come morning, the flow of guests at midday can strain provisions quickly, and careful management ensures no one goes away hungry. At the peak of the meal, the inn is alive in every sense. Dogs linger near the doorway, tails wagging in hope of scraps. A minstrel arrives, plucking a lute softly, filling the air with gentle melodies. For a moment, the weariness of travel fades for those within the walls. Laughter rises, conversations spark across tables, and the heavy burdens of life on the road are eased. The innkeeper moves quietly among them all, a guiding presence that ensures order amid the bustle. As the sun begins its slow descent, the frenzy of midday, others remain longer, drinking and conversing as the afternoon stretches before them. The innkeeper takes a moment to wipe his brow, satisfied with the hum of contentment filling the room. Another rush has passed, and the inn stands steady, its heart beating strong in the service of those who seek its shelter. The inn was the heart of the village, but to keep it beating, supplies had to flow in and out with careful rhythm. The morning crowd had dispersed now, leaving behind the faint smell of ale, bread crusts scattered on the floor, and the lingering warmth of conversation. With a nod to his wife, the innkeeper tied a leather pouch at his belt, checked its weight, and stepped outside. It was market day, and there were errands to run. The village market square lay a short walk away, beyond winding lanes where cottages leaned into one another, their timber frames darkened with age. The innkeeper passed neighbors along the way, exchanging brief greetings, for everyone knew him by sight. His livelihood depended not only on what he could sell inside the inn, but on the bargains and friendships formed out here among the merchants. The square buzzed with life. Wooden stalls leaned under the weight of goods, draped in cloths of muted colors. Farmers displayed baskets of root vegetables still dusted with soil. Butchers sharpened their knives, their aprons stained faintly with crimson. Fishmongers called out prices over the salty smell of their catch, brought in from a nearby river that very morning. Chickens squawked and flapped in wicker cages, and the sound of their protest rose above the hum of bargaining voices. The innkeeper moved with practiced purpose, His eyes scanned the stalls, noting which traders had the freshest produce, who had come in from the next town, and who was eager to sell quickly. He stopped first at the baker's table, where loaves of dark rye and pale wheat bread lay stacked in orderly rows. Bread was the foundation of any meal, and though his wife baked some herself, it never hurt to have extra on hand for unexpected guests. He purchased several loaves, sliding a few coins into the baker's palm with a quiet word. Next came the butcher, cuts of pork, mutton, and even a side of beef hung from hooks. Beneath the stall's canopy, the innkeeper knew the value of variety, for weary travellers often longed for something hearty. He bartered for sausages and a slab of salted pork, both easy to keep stored. Coins exchanged, hands shook, and the meat was wrapped in rough cloth. The fishmonger greeted him with a wide grin, already lifting a glistening trout from his basket. The innkeeper nodded. Fresh fish was a treat, though it required swift cooking. He chose two, imagining the sizzling sound they would make over the hearth later that night. Beyond food, there were other supplies to gather. Barrels of ale had been ordered from the brewer in the next village, but today he needed smaller things. Candles from the chandler, coarse salt from a travelling merchant, and a bundle of herbs from the apothecary's stall. Each purchase seemed small on its own, yet together they formed the unseen foundation of the inn's daily life. Without these things, no bed would feel warm, no meal complete, no evening fire bright enough. As he moved through the market, the innkeeper also listened. Gossip travelled as swiftly as goods here, and information was nearly as valuable. One farmer spoke of a road blocked by fallen trees after a storm. A merchant muttered about higher tolls at the bridge. Another man mentioned that a band of performers might soon be arriving, promising music and stories. The innkeeper filed each piece of news away. Guests often brought their own tales, but it never hurt to have a few stories ready to share, lending the inn an air of worldly knowledge. At one stall, a young shepherd offered cheese wrapped in cloth. The innkeeper sampled a piece, the tang sharp and creamy. He bought 2 wheels, knowing that cheese paired well with ale and bread, a simple meal that many travellers would welcome. Nearby, a woman sold apples, their skins shining red and gold. He purchased a basket of those as well, remembering how quickly they disappeared once placed in the common room. By the time his pouch felt considerably lighter, his arms were filled with bundles and baskets. The weight was familiar, not burdensome, for he knew that each item carried the promise of coin in return once transformed into meals and comforts for his patrons. As he turned back toward the inn, he paused briefly to look around the square. Merchants called, villagers haggled, children darted between stalls with sticky hands and laughing voices. It was the pulse of village life, and he was both part of it and apart from it. His inn was not just a building, but a gathering place, one that depended on this marketplace like a hearth depends on kindling. He made his way home, careful with the fish so it would not spill from its wrapping, steady with the bread so it would not be crushed. As the familiar shape of the inn came into view, his wife was already at the door, ready to take the baskets from his arms. Together they carried the market's bounty inside. Filling, they carried the market's bounty inside, filling shelves and cupboards until the inn once again seemed ready to welcome the evening rush. The market trip was not glamorous, nor was it new. It was a task repeated week after week, season after season. Yet in its repetition lay the rhythm of survival, the heartbeat of the inn. Each loaf of bread, each wheel of cheese, Each whisper of gossip from the market square kept the inn alive, and through the inn, the village itself remained a place where travelers might pause, rest, and remember the taste of home. The night air hung heavy in the narrow streets of colonial Boston. Lanterns swayed at door fronts, their light dim and trembling, throwing jagged shadows across cobblestones slick with evening dew. A figure moved quickly along the edge of the buildings, keeping to the darkest paths, where the light of the moon could not betray him. This was Elias, the spy whose quiet work in the shadows carried information that might one day determine the fate of a young nation. He clutched a folded scrap of parchment close to his chest, tucked beneath the lining of his coat. It was not large, no bigger than the palm of his hand, yet the weight of it felt immense. The message it carried, carefully written in a cipher only a select few could read, contained the movements of British regiments and the names of informants hidden within the colonial militia. Discovery would mean death, not only for Elias, but for every man and woman whose names were written within the coded lines. He slowed at the corner of a lane where the narrow street curved toward the harbor. The smell of tar and salt clung to the air. Horses clattered in the distance, their riders most likely redcoat patrols, enforcing curfews and watching for unrest. Elias leaned against the wall of a tavern, pretending to fumble with his shoe buckle, while his eyes scanned the street. 2 soldiers passed, muskets slung over their shoulders, speaking in low voices about rations and rumors of rebellion. He remained still, his breath shallow, until their voices faded into the night. When the street grew silent once more, he slipped forward, boots whispering against the stones. Every step carried risk. Every shadow seemed alive, stretching across the walls like long fingers reaching for him. Yet he pressed on, knowing that his small act of courage would help keep the web of resistance alive. He turned into a quieter alley where the wooden boards of houses pressed close together. Here, the shutters were drawn and silence hung thick. A small dog barked from somewhere within the alley, and Elias froze. He crouched, hand instinctively reaching for the knife he kept hidden in his belt. But after a tense pause, the barking ceased, and all was still again. At last, he reached his destination, a modest house with weathered shingles and a narrow door. A single candle flickered in the upstairs window, its flame a signal. Elias tapped 3 times on the door, paused, then tapped twice more. For a moment, nothing stirred. Then the door creaked open, and the faint light of a lantern revealed a woman with sharp eyes and a steady expression. Her name was Margaret, and though few would ever know her role, she was as much a part of the rebellion as any soldier on the battlefield. "You're late," she whispered. "Patrols," Elias replied. Slipping inside, the door closed softly, shutting out the world. Inside, the room smelled faintly of ink, smoke. On the table lay a stack of papers, quills, and a small inkwell. Margaret took the folded scrap of parchment from Elias's coat and immediately set to work, her hands quick and practiced. She did not need to read it to know what it contained. Her task was simply to prepare its copy, to be sent by a different courier in case one was lost or captured. Elias leaned against the wall, listening to the scratch of her quill. The house felt safe, yet he knew safety was an illusion. Only the day before, 2 men had been arrested on suspicion of treason. They had not been spies, merely tradesmen speaking too freely, but the crown's men were relentless, and mistakes came at a high price. When Margaret finished, she dried the ink with a sprinkle of fine sand, then folded the papers with deliberate care. She handed one to Elias, and placed the other inside a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard. "Take this to the wharf," she instructed. "A fisherman leaves for Marblehead before dawn. He'll carry it farther." Elias nodded, tucking the copy into his coat. He knew the fisherman well, a wiry man with weather-beaten skin and eyes that never lingered too long on a stranger. The man asked no questions, only rowed his boat across the waves, delivering words that held more weight than barrels of gunpowder. Before Elias left, Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "Be careful," she said softly. "They're watching closer than ever." "I always am," Elias replied, though the truth was far less certain. Every time he stepped into the streets, he felt the press of danger, the awareness that a single wrong move could end everything. Yet he also felt something else, a steady resolve. If freedom was to be won, it would not come only from battles with muskets and cannons. It would come from the whispers, the secret letters, the careful steps taken in the dead of night. He slipped back into the darkness, the parchment warm against his chest, and disappeared once more into the maze of Boston's shadowed streets. The first light of morning has fully spread across the medieval castle. By now, the servants are busy with countless tasks that keep the great fortress running. Among the most important spaces of all is the inner courtyard, the open square around which the castle buildings are arranged. It is here that the lives of both high and low meet, sometimes colliding, sometimes simply brushing past. The courtyard is rarely quiet. The clatter of buckets being carried from the well, the rhythmic chop of firewood, and the sound of horses being led from their stables all combine into a constant hum of activity. For a servant, the courtyard is a place of both work and connection, a stage where duties are performed and small moments of camaraderie or gossip are exchanged. At the center stands the great well, carved deep into the ground, lined with stone, and capped with a sturdy wooden frame. Water is drawn from it by a pulley with thick rope and heavy buckets. Several times each morning, servants take turns hauling water, pouring it into barrels or clay jars to be carried to kitchens, chambers, and washing areas. Water is heavy, and spilling it is frowned upon. Those assigned this task often work in pairs, balancing a yoke across their shoulders with a bucket dangling from each end. On one side of the courtyard lies the kitchen garden, where herbs, cabbages, and onions grow in neat rows. It is not large, for the castle relies mainly on surrounding fields and tenant farmers for supplies, but it provides essential fresh greens. A servant might be sent out to snip rosemary for a stew or to pull leeks from the soil for the evening supper. In the morning sun, the scent of herbs drifts through the courtyard, mingling with the sharper tang of horses from the stables. The stables themselves are another hub of activity. A stable boy, barely into his teens, brushes down the horses with stiff straw brushes, his hands moving quickly. He pauses to clean hooves with a small iron pick. The animals snort, flicking their ears, stamping impatiently when hungry. Servants assigned to stable duty work tirelessly, feeding oats, hauling hay, and ensuring that the Lord's prized horses remain sleek and well-groomed. Horses were wealth, power, and prestige, and caring for them was a matter of pride. Across the way, The armory looms like a silent guardian. Its heavy oak doors are usually shut, but occasionally a knight or a squire passes through, carrying weapons or armor for polishing. Inside, racks of swords and spears line the walls, while shields hang in neat rows. Servants may be called upon to carry equipment, mend leather straps, or sharpen blades. The clang of hammer against metal echoes faintly, though much of the smith's work is done in a separate forge beyond the walls. The courtyard also serves as a space for training and practice. Squires run drills with wooden swords, striking at straw, dummies or sparring with one another under the watchful eye of a knight. Their shouts and laughter fill the air, but servants watch from the edges, mindful not to draw attention unless summoned. Sometimes, a servant might be asked to reset a target or fetch water for weary squires, but more often they continue with their sweeping, scrubbing, or hauling unnoticed. The laundry area is set near one corner of the courtyard, close to where the water can be dumped. There, women servants kneel over large wooden tubs, scrubbing linens against rough boards, with ash lye or soap made from animal fat. Their hands turn red and raw, yet the work continues, piles of damp cloth drying on ropes strung across the open air. The courtyard, with its sun and breeze, is the best place for such work, though in winter the task becomes far harsher. It is in the courtyard, too, where news and stories spread most quickly. Servants crossing paths exchange whispers, rumors of Anne. Approaching guest, word of a band of outlaws in the forest, or simple complaints about a stern steward or a heavy workload. These moments of conversation may be brief, for tasks press on, but they form the threads of companionship that keep spirits from breaking under endless labor. The castle's children, if they live within its walls, sometimes play in the courtyard as well. Their laughter brings a lighter sound to the air, though they must be watched carefully lest they wander too close to horses or training squires. Servants are often charged with minding them, combining childcare with their daily tasks. A servant sweeping may also keep one eye on a mischievous toddler darting after a chicken. Above, from windows and balconies, the higher-born residents occasionally look down upon the courtyard. A lady of the castle might pause on a gallery to watch the activity below, her gown trailing behind her. A knight may stand on the steps, issuing orders before striding off to duties of his own. For servants, such glances from above are a reminder of their place, ever under the gaze of those they serve. As the sun rises higher, shadows shorten. The morning duties draw to a close, though the work is never truly done. New tasks begin, setting up for the midday meal, preparing chambers for visitors, polishing wood and stone to keep the castle in order. The courtyard continues to hum, each servant a small part of the machine that keeps the great household functioning. By midday, the courtyard will quiet for a time, the clamour of morning replaced by the lull of meal and rest. But for now, as the air is filled with the clink of buckets, the whinny of horses, and the scrape of broom against stone, it stands as the very heart of the castle's life, where the invisible hands of servants keep the visible strength of the fortress alive. As twilight settled over the medieval village, the inn began to take on a different character. The lively bustle of travellers coming and going had slowed, and the warmth of the hearth now glowed steadily against the growing chill of the night. For the innkeeper, the close of day was not a time to relax, but rather to ensure that every last detail of his establishment was set in order before he too could find a few hours of rest. The first task was always the settling of accounts. Behind the main hall, in a small chamber that doubled as an office, the innkeeper kept his records. A sturdy wooden table, scarred from years of use, held his ledger, ink, and quills. By candlelight, he carefully listed the names of guests, the number of nights they had stayed, the meals they had taken, and any other charges such as stable fees or laundry. Numbers were not as exact in those times as they are today, but an experienced innkeeper prided himself on keeping accurate tallies. Mistakes in records could mean disputes, and disputes meant bad reputation. A danger in a trade so dependent on trust. Once the books were closed for the day, the innkeeper walked through the hall again. The long trestle tables were cleared, wiped down with damp cloths, and the benches pushed neatly beneath them. The fire in the great hearth was banked, covered with ash, so it would smoulder through the night, ready to be revived at dawn. On the walls, candles flickered low, their wax dripping onto wooden holders. Some would be extinguished to save costs, but a few were left burning faintly, providing enough light to guide guests who stirred in the night. The inn's rooms upstairs also required inspection. Many inns of the time did not offer private chambers, but shared spaces where several travelers would sleep side by side on straw mattresses. Privacy was a luxury. The innkeeper carried a small lamp as he moved from one room to the next, checking that the bedding was dry and the shutters closed against the night wind. If a wealthy merchant had taken one of the rare private rooms, the innkeeper made certain it was to his satisfaction, for such guests often returned and spread word of their experiences along the trade roads. Down in the stables, the final tasks were equally important. The innkeeper or his hired boy ensured the horses were fed one last measure of hay and watered before being left to rest. Traveling merchants often valued the care of their animals even more than their own lodgings, for a strong horse could mean the difference between profit and ruin. A well-run stable was as much a selling point for an inn as warm food or a clean bed. As the hour grew late, the inn itself grew quieter. Only a few stragglers remained by the hearth, often locals reluctant to return home or travelers who found conversation too pleasant to end. The innkeeper let them linger, but he gently reminded them that the doors would soon be barred. In medieval times, safety was a constant concern, and an innkeeper bore the responsibility of protecting those under his roof. Once the guests retired, the heavy wooden doors were shut, and strong iron bars slid into place. No one would enter or leave until dawn without rousing the innkeeper. With the inn secure, the innkeeper finally allowed himself a moment of stillness. Sometimes he would sit by the fire, sipping a small cup of ale or watered wine, listening to the crackle of the embers. It was a quiet hour, a pause before sleep, and a chance to reflect on the day. On the merchants he had met, the news carried by travelers, and the profits or losses of the business. Running an inn was no simple task. It was a life of constant labor, of balancing hospitality with caution, of keeping the fire burning while ensuring the household remained profitable. Even in those final moments before bed, the innkeeper's mind was never fully at rest. Tomorrow would bring new travelers, new stories, and new challenges. A nobleman's retinue might appear, demanding fine treatment. A troupe of entertainers might stop by, filling the hall with music and laughter. Or perhaps the day would be quiet, with only a few weary pilgrims stopping on their way to a distant shrine. The unpredictability of each day was both the burden and the reward of his profession. At last, When the inn was still, he climbed the narrow stairs to his own chamber. Unlike his guests, the innkeeper enjoyed the comfort of a private room, though it was plain compared to the chambers of nobility. A sturdy bed of wood and rope held a mattress stuffed with straw, covered with woolen blankets. A chest in the corner held his few possessions, and on the wall hung a small crucifix, a reminder of faith and protection. He set his lamp on a stool, extinguished it with a careful breath, and lay down. The sounds of the inn settled into the quiet of night. A faint rustling from the stable, a murmur from a dreaming guest, the steady crackle of the smouldering hearth below. In that silence, the innkeeper closed his eyes, content that his establishment stood ready for another day. Thus ended a single day in the life of a medieval innkeeper, a cycle of work, responsibility, and fleeting moments of rest, woven into the larger rhythm of a world where travelers carried news across lands, and inns like his stood as havens of warmth and safety in the long, uncertain journeys of medieval life. The sun had set long ago, and the inn was quiet now. Most of the villagers who had gathered for ale, dice, and chatter had either stumbled home or dozed off by the hearth. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the muffled breathing of travelers in the loft above. For the innkeeper, however, the night was far from over. That evening, a messenger had rushed in, warning of the arrival of an important guest. A nobleman, passing through the region, required lodging. Such visits were both a blessing and a burden. Nobles brought money, and their presence raised the status of the inn. Yet they also demanded comfort far beyond what a rough-hewn village inn was designed to provide. The innkeeper moved with urgency, his heavy steps echoing on the wooden floor. He inspected every corner, from the rushes spread across the floor to the benches against the walls. He ordered the youngest boy to fetch fresh straw for the guest bed, and scolded the pot boy for letting the ale pitcher sit empty. He knew nobles expected cleanliness, at least by medieval standards. The air, thick with smoke and the smell of roasted meat, was hardly refined, but the innkeeper stoked the fire to keep the hall warm and sprinkled herbs such as lavender and sage across the rushes to mask the smell. Every detail mattered, for nobles could be quick to complain, and complaints could ruin an inn's reputation as swiftly as a tavern brawl. The arrival near midnight, the sound of hooves clattered in the yard. Lanterns swung as the stable boy rushed to greet the riders. The nobleman's entourage was small, just a handful of retainers, but even this modest company carried an air of authority. The noble himself stepped inside wearing a heavy cloak trimmed with fur, his boots muddy from the road. His sword glimmered faintly in the firelight, and his manner suggested he was used to command. The innkeeper bowed deeply, lowering his head, though he could not help but glance at the noble's face. To his relief, the man did not scowl. Instead, he nodded curtly and asked for food, drink, and a clean bed. The innkeeper quickly ushered him to the best chamber, a small room above the hall, with a bedstead of wood and rope, covered in straw and woolen blankets. It was simple, but compared to the loft, where other travelers slept side by side, it was a luxury. Feeding a noble back in the kitchen, the innkeeper's wife and daughter hurried to prepare a meal. Most of the food from supper was gone, but they managed to gather a platter of bread, soft cheese, smoked ham, and a jug of wine reserved for special occasions. The noble's retainers were offered pottage and ale, though the innkeeper made certain their cups were always full. Serving a noble was a delicate art. Too little food, and he might think himself insulted. too much, and it seemed wasteful, as though the innkeeper were trying to curry favor. The innkeeper balanced between hospitality and humility, speaking politely but not too boldly. The nobleman ate in silence, his retainers chatting quietly. Occasionally, the innkeeper caught the man's eye and bowed slightly, ever ready to fetch more. He knew that one poor impression could lead to a scathing word spread across the shire. Midnight worries when the noble finally retired. The innkeeper did not rest. He lingered in the hall, staring at the embers in the hearth. Hosting a noble always carried risk. What if a servant accused the inn of theft? What if the noble demanded more than the innkeeper could provide? Even a small slight might bring the sheriff's men to his door. He checked the locks on the doors and ordered the stable boy to watch the noble's horses as if they were treasures. Then he walked the hall one last time, straightening stools and collecting stray cups. His wife urged him to sleep, but he only shook his head. For an ordinary traveler, we can afford a mistake, he said softly. But for men like him, one mistake could cost us the inn. The innkeeper finally lay down in the corner room, though sleep came fitfully. Dreams of nobles, taxes, and swords haunted him until the faint light of dawn crept in. Reflection: the noble would ride on by morning, his presence a brief but weighty reminder of how fragile an innkeeper's fortune could be. For the villagers, the inn was a place of laughter, stories, and simple comfort. For nobles, it was an oasis on the road, yet one where every detail mattered. As he rose, weary but resolved, the innkeeper reminded himself that this was the life he had chosen. Balancing mugs of ale, tending fires, soothing quarrels, and bowing to both peasant and noble alike. In the end, an inn was not just a building. It was a stage where every night played out dramas of food, drink, and human need, and the innkeeper was always at the center of the performance. The night had grown deep, and silence had returned to the inn. The last of the guests had retired. The shutters were bolted against the cool breeze, and only the faint crackle of the fire kept the hall alive. The innkeeper, weary but still restless, sat alone at the long table, a mug of ale in his hand. This was his moment of peace, the time when his bustling inn belonged only to him. He looked around the room, lit by the dim glow of embers. The benches bore the marks of countless travelers who had carved their names or scratched idle patterns into the wood. The walls smelled faintly of smoke, spiced with the aroma of stews and bread that had simmered all day. The inn was more than a building. It was a witness to lives passing through. Merchants, monks, nobles, pilgrims, even outlaws, all had sat at these tables, told their stories, shared their laughter, or whispered their secrets into the night. The innkeeper leaned back, stretching his sore legs. His work was not glamorous, but it was steady. He had seen entire villages depend on the presence of an inn. Without one, where would the messengers stop to rest? Where would pilgrims find shelter? Where would neighbors gather to share ale and song? He understood that his work, though humble, was woven into the very rhythm of medieval life. The burden and pride of hospitality running an inn was not easy. Supplies had to be carefully measured. Too much ale poured one week meant short rations the next. Wood for the fire had to be hauled in from nearby forests, often in the damp chill of early morning. Inns attracted good company, but also trouble. A drunken quarrel could turn into a brawl. A thief might slip through the door, disguised as a weary traveler. Even disease traveled along the same road as trade, carried by those who came and went. But still, The innkeeper found pride in his work. A successful night meant no one had gone hungry, everyone had a bed, and the guests left in better spirits than when they had arrived. His reputation stretched further than he knew. Travellers often told one another about this or that inn, and good word kept his benches filled, and his hearth bright. The innkeeper often remembered his father's words, "A man who opens his door to travellers holds the key to the world." And indeed, through his doorway had passed men from France, women from Italy, traders from far-off lands with strange accents and stranger wares. Without ever leaving his village, the innkeeper had glimpsed a world wider than he could ever travel. The quiet after the storm now, in the calm of the firelight, he reflected on the day. He remembered the pilgrims who had prayed before eating, their rough feet sore from the road. He thought of the merchants who haggled, not just in the marketplace, but even at his table, bargaining for stew and ale, as if each coin were gold. He smiled at the memory of a bard who had once paid for his bed with song instead of silver, leaving the hall ringing with music long after he had gone. And he thought of the dangers too. He remembered a night when soldiers had arrived, demanding food and drink without payment. That night he had feared his livelihood would be destroyed in an instant, yet fortune had favored him. They left before dawn, leaving behind only empty mugs and tense silence. Every night carried its risks. Every morning brought new beginnings. Such was the life of an innkeeper, a steady rhythm of work, risk, and reward. The inn as a living chronicle. As he gazed into the glowing embers, the innkeeper felt that his inn was not merely a place of rest. It was a living book of stories. It was a living book of stories. Each visitor left a mark. Some in words carved into wood, some in coins exchanged, some in memories that only he carried. He alone knew the gossip whispered in corners, the secret tears shed into mugs of ale, the joy of reunions when families embraced after long journeys. The inn was a mirror of the medieval world. It reflected the hardships of travel, the faith of pilgrims, the ambition of merchants, and the hunger for companionship that drove people to gather around a fire, no matter their station in life. It was strange, he thought, how so many stories began and ended in a place like his. A stranger might set out from his door at dawn, never to be seen again, his fate swallowed by the roads and the wilderness. Others returned year after year, growing older, their faces lined with time, but always grateful for a familiar roof and a warm meal. The inn was not just his livelihood. It was a witness to the fragile thread of human life. Closing the day at last, the innkeeper rose from his seat. He drained the last of his ale, savouring the taste, then moved to the hearth. With a poker, he shifted the logs so that the fire would smoulder until morning. A faint glow filled the hall, casting long shadows across the benches. He made one last round of the room, checking bolts, securing the pantry, and peeking into the stable where the animals shifted softly in sleep. At the top of the stairs, he paused and looked back. The empty hall seemed peaceful, its silence a reward for a day's hard labor. Tomorrow, the door would open again, and new voices would fill the air. But for tonight, the innkeeper allowed himself the luxury of stillness. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking underfoot. His bed awaited him. Simple, but enough. As he lay down, he whispered a short prayer, not for riches, but for steady custom, safe roads, and health to keep serving those who sought his hearth. And with that, the innkeeper closed his eyes. The fire below burned low, holding back the night, just as it always had, just as it always would.